All-Star reserve announcements coming up. Will the Pacers have a 2025 All-Star? Should they? What is the main competition for their best candidates? Plus, it's Pistons time. Games are back for the Pacers, and we have much to discuss on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Wednesday, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes, and today it's game day. The Pacers are back on like a normal schedule. They've only played twice in like 10 days. It's been weird. But before we talk about any of that and the Pistons, we're talking All-Stars. This is the week we find out the reserves the NBA will send to San Francisco for the Bay Area for the 2025 All-Star Game. We got the announcement of the rising stars, both in the G League and the NBA, on Tuesday. No Pacers involved there or Madden. It's not a surprise. And an All-Star reserves get announced on Thursday. I think something is Wednesday. Maybe it's the Friday night or Saturday night, participants. We'll see if any Pacers are there, and we'll talk about it later in the week. But we must start with the real thing, the accolade that matters, the one that people talk about a lot. Could the Pacers have somebody? Should they? I'll make the case for the two guys that I think everybody would agree are the two most likely candidates, even though one seems far more likely than the other. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Pistons as the Pacers are back in action tonight. So, All-Star starters were announced in the East last week. Great. Jalen Brunson, Donovan Mitchell, Tatum, Giannis, and Kat, the five that I think, that was pretty easy to me, although I would have had Darius Garland over Donovan Mitchell. It doesn't matter what I think. What matters is, will the Pacers have somebody in the game when it's time? And I think that the important guy to lead with for this is Pascal Siakam. And if you hop on NBA.com right now, you can see that they have put out a piece, trending topics, picking East All-Star reserves that they released this week. I cannot find a date on here. It looks like it was updated today, the day I'm speaking, the 28th, but I don't know when it was specifically published. Regardless, NBA.com staff writer Steve Ashburner has Pascal Siakam among his reserves. Brian Martin has Pascal Siakam among his reserves. Sean Powell, guess what? He has Pascal Siakam above his reserves. I could go through tons of articles that I just read in prepping for this and looking at my lists and making cases and making non-cases. Pascal Siakam was on a very high number of lists, right? And a lot has changed. I've had this conversation 3 times. Once in November, mostly just so I could talk about how good Siakam was playing at the time when the Pacers weren't playing that well. Once in December when voting came out, to get a little more specific. And something I said in December, and this applies to Haliburton, who we'll get to later as well, was the problem the Pacers are having, or were having, was they weren't good enough at the time, right? A lot of times, some teams have a good enough record that they almost default into getting somebody. And the example I always use is the year Sabonis made it for the Pacers the second time. He was an injury replacement, and he deserved it. He had a good season. It's not like it was a fraudulent All-Star pick. He's made it a bunch since then. But the Pacers were like in 4th the day he got named a reserve, and then they fell to like 9th by the end of the week because they were playing so poorly. You know, had they been in 9th earlier, I wonder if he would have or would not have made the game that year. I think that's the year he won or did very well in the skills challenge. Regardless of that context, the Pacers are now in 5th, right? And I guess, I don't know, the Bucks are playing right now. I have no idea what the scores of that game. I don't know if this is possible, but pending results, maybe they could be in 4th by the time the selections are done, but they won't be any lower than 5th, right? They're 2 games ahead of 6th. So they're going to be a top 5 team in the conference by the time selections are done. And that is generally high enough where you get to a spot where, you know, the selection group will say, well, someone on that team, you know, has to make it. 5th in the West is the Lakers, like LeBron and Anthony Davis are both going to make it, right? So, and it could be the Clippers by then, and maybe they won't. But regardless of all this stuff I'm saying, Siakam on team record and being the most consistent and best performer on the Pacers this year has a good case right there. Stop. Like that alone gets him in there. I'm going to go farther than that because I always do. Let's talk about what Siakam has done this year, which is be so consistent. 20 points a game, 20.2 to be exact, which is actually his lowest since 2018-19. But that is also on fewer shot attempts. 14.8 is also his fewest shot attempts since 2018-19. His efficiency is still solid, right? Shooting well. The three-point line has not been his friend, the free throw line has not been his friend. The three-point line has. This is his highest true shooting percentage since that 2018-19 season. So The volume's down a little bit, but he's exchanged it for wonderful efficiency, right? Over 60% true shooting is awesome, especially when you can reach 20 points a game. His usage is still very healthy at 23.2%. He is rebounding like crazy, 7.4 per game. That would be the second best number of his entire career. Last time he hit that number for a full season, he was an all-star. The time before that, he made All-NBA, right? 3.4 assists is actually way down for his career. The last time he didn't hit that number was his most improved player season, but still a good number for a guy who largely finishes plays with the ball. I keep using his cutoffs exactly when I make the case for Pascal Siakam as an all-star, which is, I admit, a little lazy. But just to be clear, here are the 14 players in the NBA this season who are averaging 20.2 points, 3.3 rebounds, and 7.3 rebounds and 3.3 assists per game. There are 14 of them. Pascal Siakam is one of them. There are Nikola Jokic, Domantas Sabonis, Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Davis, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Jason Tatum, Siakam, LeBron James, Victor Wembanyama, Luka Doncic, Scotty Barnes, Joel Embiid, Paolo Banchero, and Zion Williamson. Step one of seeing that information. That's a great crew of players, guys who have been or will be all-stars many times in their career. Thing two, you might think, Jokic, Sabonis, Anthony Davis, LeBron, Wemby, Luka, Zion. That's a lot of Western Conference players. Thing three, you might think, Zion's barely played this year. You'd be correct. He's only played 12 games. Joel Embiid's barely played this year. You'd be correct. He's played 13 games. Paolo Banchero's barely played this year. You'd be correct. He's played 14 games. Scotty Barnes has barely played this year. You'd be incorrect. I thought that and was wrong. He's played 33 games. I don't know why I thought it was less than that. And Luka, obviously, at 22, probably not going to be making All-Star. Maybe he gets it and then gets immediately replaced. Regardless, I just said a lot of things to say. You could instantly cut off 4 of those guys and say there are 10 guys who have actually played a lot this season. In fact, Siakam leads this entire group in games played, not minutes played, but games played, who are averaging 27-3 this year. That's quite the statistical threshold to reach. Siakam has won the Pacers games with his scoring, like against Boston early in the season. He's won them games with his rebounding, like in Phoenix. His passing has not, I wouldn't say won them a game or anything, but he's been a solid passer a lot this season. He's been very productive and extremely reliable for the Pacers, playing in every game, and you know what you're going to get. Very rarely does Siakam have a stinker. And this is where I think his all-star case gets very interesting. And the case I've made multiple times this season, I'm going to make it one more time because we'll find out all-stars in one day. His consistency both helps him and hurts him. What I mean by that is Siakam only has 5 games with a game score under 10, which is just like a pretty pedestrian game this season, right? He's only been under 10 points once. That game against Charlotte, which was the Pacers' low point of the year when he had 9 points and 11 rebounds, right? Every other game he's been in double figures. Most of his poor game score nights are somewhat inefficient, but he very rarely has inefficient games. He's only shot under 40% from the field 4 times the whole season. 40% is not like a good shooting night, but if you're 40% or better, no one walks away from it thinking, man, that guy stunk tonight. He was really all over the place. He was 4 for 13 in Toronto, and then every other game he's been at 37.5% or higher. And only once did he do that on a high volume of shots. That's when they won in Cleveland, and he took 21 shots and only made 8. And he was still pretty good that game, right? So very, very, very rarely does Pascal Siakam have a bad game. And very rarely is he like so off the mark with his finishing. That's because he's a master of his mid-range craft. He gets to the rim very often. He punishes switches, right? I could go on and on about the stuff that makes Pascal Siakam great. You know it. You've watched him play games this season. So the consistency has been huge for the Pacers. However, that is also probably the thing limiting his case the most, is that he does not have the wow games, right? I just watched Tyrese Maxey, who's going to come up in this podcast continuing, have a 40-plus point game. Siakam has not even hit 30 once this season, right? He's hit 29 twice. The game against Boston that he won them, and the game against Portland that they snuck through that he was terrific in. I think all the Pacer stars were very good that game, right? He's been he's at 25 plus 11 times, right? He's got that mark, no problem. A fourth of their games, Pascal Siakam's getting 25 plus. That 30 barrier, that like, oh, wow, game just hasn't happened, right? So I'm saying a lot to say that he doesn't have that part of the star, like, wow factor down, but he doesn't have any stinkers either. And I think that consistency is what makes him such a valuable player. I think he should be an all-star. What I'm going to do in this conversation that I haven't done when I'm making the case for these players before is look at their competition, right? I usually just looked at Siakam's stats and made the case for him before. The front court in the East is actually the best thing going for Siakam's favor. The 3 guys who are clearly ahead of him are already in, right? And there's one more guy I think is clearly ahead of him, but it's not a loaded field. The guard field has a lot more players that are in Haliburton's way. The front court field, outside of the three that are already in there, obviously, in Kat, Tatum, and Giannis, is Evan Mobley, no doubter to me. Evan Mobley is going to be a first-time All-Star this year. Is Jaylen Brown going to be a wing or a guard? I don't know. Is he really been that much better than Siakam? Check out how Jaylen Brown's been playing recently. Not bad, but substandard for him. Jared Allen has been exceptional this year. He has a case as well. And after that, it's like Paolo Banchero, who's missed a ton of games. Jalen Johnson, who's been pretty good but has missed some games. Franz Wagner, who's missed a lot of games. So Siakam has a great case on that aspect of it, too, in that the front court competition is a little weaker this year. And you could make a case that Brown, Mobley, and Allen have all been better than him this year, but then you get to the wild cards, and I think you could put Siakam above a lot of the lower end guards in the East as well, who we'll talk about in the next segment. So not only do I think Siakam on his own merit at his own position has a very good chance to be named a 3-time All-Star, a 3rd-time All-Star, but I also think that the competition in his specific position really works in his favor. If you told me the Pacers only had one All-Star, I would assume it's Siakam. But let's talk about the guy who made it last year and the year before, Tyrese Haliburton. Does he actually have a case? I think you might be thinking a little too low of it, but you're probably right with your gut instinct. Let's talk about that coming right up. Before we talk Tyrese Haliburton All-Star, we need to talk about Gametime, attending NFL playoff games, the Super Bowl, unforgettable experience that brings fans together, and that is the joy of live sports. The excitement and energy of playoff games or anything you can attend is as fun as it gets. Music, theater, comedy, seeing the Pacers, anything can be fun and more fun in person. And Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your events even easier. Filters out the fluff to only show you incredible deals on great seats. You don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. But if you do, you'll be glad you did. You can use Gametime Picks to find tickets for playoff games, for Pacers games, NBA games. But if you browse through all their deals, you'll find great value for all kinds of seats around the venue. They have super deals. They have seat views, all in pricing, so there's no surprise fees at checkout. And it's all smooth and reliable. Plus, on-time ticket delivery, lowest price guarantee gives peace of mind for everybody. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. We're back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making it your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen has to be Locked On Sacramento Kings. Matt George, I already listened to it on the De'Aaron Fox stuff, reporting on Fox's potential availability, and a team lasered in on making that a thing. Wow. What a crazy season for the Kings. Matt George covers that team spectacularly and was all over this Fox stuff. He did a great job breaking that down. It's going to be a story for the next 8 days till the trade deadline is here. Speaking of trade deadline, if you missed it yesterday, I ran through what I would consider the credible reports about the Pacers heading into the deadline, so you can feel prepped about what the chatter is. Plus, on the 15th or 16th, Rhett Bauer and I talked about the Pacers trade deadline outlook, given their current reality. Speaking of reality, Tyrese Haliburton's reality has been fascinating this season, right? Because there's something I always say with players. First impressions go a long way in how people assess your season. And I will not use the same example I always do. Longtime listeners know exactly who it is and what season it was. I'll just tell you it was Jeff Teague. But regardless, Haliburton, one thing working strongly against him was his start to the season. Through that Charlotte game, right? The first 25 games of the Pacers season, Tyrese Haliburton averaged 17.5 points and 8.4 assists on 42% from the field, 33.6% from deep. That's not that, that wasn't that great for him. And he knew it. And he talked about it all the time. And he struggled with it. And he tried to find the joy in basketball. And he hit a low point with that Charlotte loss. And he's been great ever since. I don't think people realize, he has been great since that game. That is not an exaggeration. Just per game stats, which I think sells Haliburton short because he is very much a gravity guy, very much a make his teammates better guy, even when it's not him necessarily setting up a specific shot. Since that Charlotte game, 19 games, so approaching the same sample size, 18.7 points, 9 assists per game on 49.2, 41, 88 splits. Very efficient. Scoring, passing is there. That guy, for the last 19 games, is basically the player he was 2 years ago when, guess what? He was an all-star. He made it. He wasn't even an injury reserve. His scoring was a little better that year, but it's not that much different statistically and efficiency-wise than that. But one, his start of the season was dreadful. And like that sample I talk about through the Charlotte game does include a few games right before it where he was actually better. Like if you just go through that December 1st loss in Memphis where he scored 8 points, it's down to 17 points a game and the shooting gets even worse. And like, if you go to the first 15 games where he had the 4-point game in Houston, it's 15 points a game to start the season on under 40% from the field. Like you all saw it. If you watch the show, you know the deal. He started very bad, and that impression lasts on a lot of people, and his turnaround has been a big part of the Pacers' turnaround. So I would say since basically December started, he has been an all-star level player, no doubt. And that sometimes a flurry or late surge from a player gets them in, like boom by default. Cade Cunningham's going to have that this year. Cade Cunningham, to be clear, deserves to be an all-star. He's been awesome this year, but he's been playing so well this month that the momentum and the flurry from that is almost certainly going to get him in. Haliburton didn't quite hit that level of crescendo, I think, even though his last game was exceptional. So does he actually have a case, right? If you just look at per game stats, you'd probably say no, right? And I don't think that's unfair or fair, right? Like we're talking about a guy averaging, his assist numbers per game, who's only missed one game. The high volume assist guys are very low in the NBA. Tyrese Haliburton's 5th in the league in assists per game this year behind LeBron, Cade, Jokic, and Trae Young. All those guys score more than him, too. They're also very good scorers, but only 7 guys average more than 8 assists per game. Like that is hard to do. And he is above Chris Paul in that group in the scoring department. He's above James Harden and Chris Paul and Trae Young in the efficiency department in terms of field goal percentage and 3-point percentage in many cases. Jokic breaks a lot of stuff, and I think people trust Haliburton as a shooter more than those guys, except for Jokic, obviously. So he had, of the high volume passers, he's still in a tier of his own, right? That is a strong case for him. Very few guys have his creation and scoring burden. If you look at advanced stats, this is where I think people don't realize how valuable Tyrese Haliburton is. Lots of stats that bake in statistical production and on-off data and all sorts of lineup data and also all sorts of stuff like that. Really rate Tyrese Haliburton well. Offensive blocks plus minus. Basketball References, one of their all-in-one stats says Tyrese Haliburton is the 13th best offensive player in the NBA this season. I buy that in terms of impact. 8 and BPM, which takes in the defensive component, has him as the 18th best player or most impactful. Let me be clear, not best. 18th most impactful player in the NBA this year. Above him, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Western Conference players. That would put him as the 8th best in the East. I can't believe I just counted live for a podcast. How exciting. Regardless, that's very good, right? If you're naming Eastern Conference All-Stars and that's been the 8th most impactful guy in the East, yeah, that's pretty good. EPM, what I think is the best all-in-one stat in terms of measuring impact, not skill. The best and most impactful players can and often are different things, although maybe not this year. In that, Tyrese Haliburton's EPM grades out right now in the 96th percentile, top 25 in the league. His offensive BPM's in the 99th percentile. Advanced stats tell us what the eye test does, especially since December. Tyrese Haliburton's really good and very impactful on the offensive end. And what he does for the Pacers is everything, right? He just has a gravity that, even possessions where like Andrew Nembhard takes it up and initiates and sets up the score, like Tyrese Haliburton's gravity plays a big part in that. He doesn't get an assist for that. He doesn't even register a stat a lot of the time, but he, made a lot of that possible. And he's been a part of that starting 5 that's been amazing on both ends of the floor. A lot of that, especially on offense, is possible because of him, right? I don't think his case is weak. Like, I do think he'll get a vote or two. I don't think he's going to get it, though, because 1, this is the case I've made to people when I've talked about this, and the case I've made here, his first impression was weak. And 2, he has the opposite thing going for him in terms of the East field that Pascal Siakam does, right? Last year, Haliburton did great in the fan voting. He had the great start to the season. His first impression was enormously high. He played very well all the way up through January. And the East field wasn't quite as strong as the guard, although it was pretty good. And he rolled through it, and he was a starter and deserved to be that. This year, he doesn't have a lot of that stuff going for him, and the East guard field's better, right? So Brunson in check, Donovan Mitchell in check. That's 2 great guards. Also still there, guy I already mentioned, passing like crazy, scoring pretty well, though a little inefficiently, Trae Young, right? Guy who dominated the fan voting. I don't think he should be an all-star, but he's got a good case. LaMelo Ball. Cade Cunningham, a guy I think should be an all-star. Darius Garland, a guy I think should be a starter. Damian Lillard has been quite good this season, and I haven't even mentioned him yet. Tyler Hero, Tyrese Haliburton, childhood friend, has had a great season. I don't think Tyler Hero is going to make it, but he's played very well. He's probably the Heat's best candidate. Tyrese Maxey has started the season slow. That's probably going to hold him out. Also, no Tyrese's this year would be my guess, but Tyrese Maxey's been good this year, right? Of that crew, only probably 5 of that 8 can make it. Of Haliburton, Trae Young, LaMelo Ball, Cade Cunningham, Darius Garland, Tyler Hero, Tyrese Maxey, and Damian Lillard. The only probably 5 of them at most can make it. I think it's hard to make the case that Haliburton is going to make that field. And I bet it's less than that 5 that make it just because of how the wild cards will break out. So I think the case is not that hard to make. He makes the Pacers but better. Historically, he's been their best player, and very recently has been their most important player once again. He's been awesome for a month and a half now. He's getting very close to the sample of him being good and the sample of him being not as good being the same size. His impact stats say that the Pacers go as he goes. We've seen him that that's the case. But I think the start of the season is going to hold him back because first impressions matter a lot to the people deciding. I think the fact that the Pacers are more likely to get 1 All-Star than 2 might hurt him because Siakam, I think, deserves it a little more this year. So for all the good things Tyrese Haliburton has done, and I am higher on him than anybody, which has not made me look awesome this season, but I'll stick with that take. I still think he's a terrific player. I think he's great. I think if his season was flipped, he'd have a very strong case, but I don't think he'll make it. We'll see if I'm wrong. It's possible. For example, let's say that from right now, he just had an awesome game in France, right? National TV, ESPN, the 16 points in 2.5 minutes. Let's pretend I'm going to make this up, but like from now until, and they go to LA pretty soon, right? If he plays great for the next week or 8 days, right? And then they need to name an injury replacement. That is probably his best chance because then he'll have more time to add to the sample, especially if the Pacers climb the standings. So I'm not going to rule it out, even if he's not named one on Thursday. But I think Siakam's got a better shot for tons of reasons that I already named. We'll see, though. And we'll talk about it on Friday's podcast because we'll find out on Thursday. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the Pistons. You know why we're going to do that tomorrow? Because the Pacers play the Pistons in a highly somehow anticipated game as the Pacers are back stateside. Much to discuss. Let's talk Pacers Pistons to close out this podcast. Back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Hop on over to Locked On NBA for your second listen. Why? Because you can hear me and Wes Goldberg talk about the 4 games in the NBA from Tuesday night. Some fun stuff. I got to watch Bronny play a rotation minutes, and Adam Bona blocked both Bronny and LeBron, and lots of other fun stuff. Hawks Rockets was a blast. Let's keep going here by talking about the Detroit Pistons. Somehow this game has become, I guess this is a stretch to say, but highly anticipated after the way the last game ended. Beef stew and, Jalen Duren and Siakam and some yapping, and Myles Turner puts the Legoland thing as his Instagram location, and the coaches are talking right in front of the media seating we had at the end of the game. There was some juice there, right? Clearly. But I think that the talking between these two teams really dates back to the in-season tournament game they played in Indy, where the Pistons just smashed the Pacers. They shot lights out. They played amazing, and so without knowing too much of the specifics of the beef between these two teams, clearly there's some tension rising, right? I think it's a good thing when divisional rivalries exist, and the Pacers and Bucks, lesser this year, but still thing, and the Pacers and Pistons are becoming that, and that's great. And so I think there will be something to this. It'll be Haliburton bobblehead WWE night. That's all very cool. I'm excited to see all that in place. I wonder what this will be, right? Isaiah Stewart's a tone setter. James Johnson's a tone setter. These teams certainly feel some way about each other right now. Pacers, Myles Turner shot great. Andrew Nembhard defended his tail off last time they won. That's all possible to happen again. But this is going to, the Pistons are good, right? This is not an easy game anymore. They did lose their last game, I believe, last 2 games. So they're no longer in 6th, but they're only 2.5 games behind the Pacers. They're right there in 8th, right? They could be a postseason team. Cade's that good. So in terms of the friction, I always think this stuff's a little overstated, right? Like what happened in the heat of battle the last 2 games matters, but I mean, think about how many times that there's been friction or strong friction, even in the case of the Giannis game ball stuff last year. And the next game is pretty tame, right? The next Pacers-Bucks game, the Pacers comfortably won and nothing happened, right? TJ Warren and Jimmy Butler, right, had their tiff a few seasons ago, and then the next Pacers Heat game was like, yep, that was a normal Pacers Heat game, right? Like sometimes this stuff escalates and becomes a thing, like Pacers Bucks did in the postseason, I guess, last year. But even that had to be inspired by a new player being added to the mix, and Patrick Beverley. So maybe something happens. Like there's some certainly flammable personalities on these teams, but I would expect it to just be like a passionate game and not like something that spews over the top of that. I am looking forward to it. And I think the thing that happened in the last game that's going to be the most important thing to repeat is not Myles Turner ripping in every three, although that certainly helped. It's going to be Andrew Nembhard again, if he plays. Good thing to note here. He has a thoracic spine sprain. I want to make sure I got that all correct. I don't know what that even means, but he's questionable on the injury report. I'm going to make sure I said that correctly. Yes, sprained thoracic spine. If Nembhard can't go, huge problem. He was awesome on Cade last time. Cade got going at times. Cade Cunningham is very good. It's hard to hold him down to that extent, as the Pacers saw in Indy before, but he was 7 for 21 with 7 turnovers, right? They needed him to be that substandard to really slow the Pistons starters. So that is a huge thing, right? The Pacers, despite Myles Turner's flurry, I think non-Pacers players made 5 total threes in that game in Detroit. Yeah, that's exactly right, right? Like, I think they can get enough shooting elsewhere, regardless of if he's just completely on fire again. That's not to say it wasn't important. They don't win that game without him doing that, but they can get shooting from other guys. I don't think they can get that level of effect on Cade Cunningham with other guys. So the biggest thing for me, if the Pacers are going to have that kind of game again, holding them to 100, looking pretty great on defense for much of the game. The Pistons had 19 turnovers. They shot under 40%, right? Is Nembhard. If he can't play or doesn't play or can't defend at that level, he played 41 minutes, right? They minutes matched him with Cade Cunningham. He played 39. They're going to be in trouble or searching for other solutions. And maybe they try a Mathurin Nesmith starting 5, and then we can keep pushing that discussion back further and further. But that to me is the number one thing to note, because the rest of the creators on the Pistons are good players, like will be good players, but it's not nearly the same thing, right? Isaiah Stewart and Marcus Sasser were tied for second on the Pistons in assists in that last Pacers-Pistons game. They both had 4. Asar Thompson had 3. I like the way he handles the ball. I like what he can be. I don't think of him in that way yet, right? He can kind of score and kind of pass. He will be very good, but is a tick below that level of expected player yet. Tim Hardaway Jr. is purely a scorer. Jalen Duren, Malik Beasley's going to get shots up. And Ventecchio is too. Like, they don't have that level of passing outside of Cade, who is an awesome passer and deserves credit for that. But if he is slowed or limited or just sees pressure in a way that is tough for him, that generally slows down, what Detroit can do. So that is the thing in this game. And obviously, slowing stars is important every time there's a game like that between a team that has a 1-star player and a lot of less important stuff. But specifically in this matchup, especially because we just saw how it went, it is a little different in that slowing this star is uniquely important. In fact, if you go back to that NBA Cup game when the Pistons improved to 3-0 and had a chance to get out of their group, 11 assists for Cade Cunningham in that game, right? And they had 6 from Jaden Ivey, who's unavailable now, and no one else had more than 4, right? If you limit Cade, or at least make it hard for him to set up others, even if he goes crazy, I feel like you could slow Detroit down. But they're good at other stuff, right? It's not just one player. There's a reason they're hovering around and or over 500. They are above average in 3-point percentage. They get up good rim attempts. They hit shots at the foul line. They block shots pretty well. They're a top 10 rebounding team, right? They do a lot of stuff that they got to be happy with. Their opponents are bottom 5 in rebounding, but they give up a lot of open threes. They don't protect the rim awesomely. That was not a word. They don't protect the rim exceedingly well, just decently well. Their opponents are pretty high in the assist totals. They turn it over like crazy. So if the Pacers can keep up in the possession battle, which the Pistons usually offset their rebounding and turnovers, but if the Pacers keep up in the possession battle and make life hard on Cade, I think they'll have a very good game. But they're going to need to score better than they did last time. I don't think 111 is going to cut it the way it did in Detroit. And I think they're going to need specifically better play from their guards, right? They did not have that when these two teams last met. Haliburton was okay with 17 and 8. That's a fine game, but not typically what you see of him. Nembhard's defense was amazing. I specifically mean better play from their guards offensively. Mather didn't play, but Nembhard was 4 for 11. McConnell was 1 for 7. They just need someone who can handle the ball to really pop and get going. And Haliburton did at times, but that was kind of it. So to me, keys to this one: guards get going, defense on Cade's huge, and win the possession battle. But the Pistons are good. It'll be a fun game. And I have to say it, it's a thing. This game's important for tiebreakers. They're only 2.5 apart in the standings, and it's 2-1 in the season series. Pacers can clinch the tiebreaker over the Pistons for the season with a win. Looking forward to it, and we'll break it down on tomorrow's podcast, whatever does or does not happen. Of note in the game, you got it right here on Locked On Pacers Friday. We'll talk All-Stars and what is and isn't happening there. Saturday, they play the Hawks, so that night there'll be a post-game for that one. We're back. Normal schedule and normal podcast schedule. Can't wait. Thank you guys for listening today. You can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Tony Arias. This podcast is on Twitter at Locked On Pacers as well. Hope you all had a wonderful day. We'll catch up very soon.